In the grand storybook of medieval life, being a doctor might sound impressive. Maybe you imagine scholarly robes, a respectable beard, and some kind of fancy diploma nailed to a wooden beam somewhere. But that's not quite how it worked. Becoming a doctor in the Middle Ages wasn't so much about being qualified as it was about acting confident and having a vague sense of how blood works, let's say. It's the 12th or 13th century. You're a curious young man because women rarely got the chance, and you've decided you'd like to go into medicine. This could mean a few things. You might want to become a physician, which sounds important, but mostly means you'll sit around reading old Greek texts and pretending you understand them. Or maybe you'd like to be a barber surgeon, someone who cuts things off and occasionally shaves beards. Or you could become an apothecary, which basically makes you the medieval version of a pharmacist who also dabbles in cooking, alchemy, and folk magic. No matter which branch of medicine you pick, your path to becoming a doctor doesn't necessarily involve school. Not the kind of school we think of today. Anyway, there were medical universities. Yes, Salerno in Italy, Montpellier in France, Oxford and Cambridge if you were in England, but they were expensive, slow, and often focused more on memorizing Latin than treating actual humans. These institutions were mostly for wealthy men who already had access to tutors and books. To enroll, you usually needed a background in grammar, rhetoric, logic, and Latin. Lots and lots of Latin. But even if you made it to one of these schools, your medical training wasn't exactly hands-on. You'd study ancient works by Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. These books written centuries earlier were considered sacred medical texts, even when they were wildly outdated. Galen, for instance, believed that blood was created in the liver, flowed outward, and was absorbed by the body like water into a sponge. No circulation. Just one-way blood. You were expected to believe all of it, unquestioningly. Doing otherwise could get you scolded, expelled, or worse, called a heretic. Actual human dissection was rare and frowned upon. In fact, in many parts of Europe, it was outright banned. Anatomy lessons, if offered at all, were usually just professors. Reading Galen out loud while a butcher sliced into a corpse, if one could be found. And the body might not even be human. Sometimes they used pig's dot, so let's say you didn't go to university. That didn't stop you from calling yourself a doctor. You could apprentice under another local doctor, who might be a respected healer or just someone who mixed herbs and guessed well. You follow him around, watch him bleed people, mash plants, and mutter words in Latin. If you picked it up fast enough or just declared yourself qualified, you were in business. In fact, the word doctor wasn't protected by law in most places. You just ... use it. Hang a sign. Wear a robe. If your patients didn't die too quickly, you could build a good reputation. And if they did die, well, there were always plagues and demons to blame. This led to a spectacular range of medical quality. In the same town, one doctor might be a literate monk with a shelf of texts, while another might be an illiterate field worker who learned from his grandmother. One believed in astrology. The other thought garlic cured everything. They both called themselves physicians. To be fair, some parts of the world were more organized. In Islamic cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, medicine was far more advanced. There were hospitals, exams, licensing, and real oversight. But if you were in most of medieval Europe, your local healer was probably winging it. And the tools of the trade? Not exactly modern. You might carry a urine flask to inspect patient pee in the sunlight, a few leeches, a sharp lancet for bloodletting, and a handful of herb or dried toad bits just in case. No gloves, no sterilizer, no understanding of germs. If your hands were visibly dirty, you might wipe them on your robe. That was hygiene, and robes mattered. Rich-looking clothing gave you authority. Medical knowledge was secondary to how confident and important you looked. Patients trusted appearances. If you wore a black robe lined with fur and carried a large book, whether or not you could read it, people assumed you knew your business. In cities, guilds and councils sometimes tried to regulate who could practice medicine, but Enforcement was a mess. Some areas required licenses, but bribes and social connections could bypass them. In rural villages, nobody cared. If you could stitch a wound or cure a fever with soup and sage, you were welcome. Oh, and remember, the church had a strong grip on everything, including medicine. Many believed that illness came from sin, divine punishment, or demonic possession. So priests and monks were often the most trusted healers. Prayer was a valid treatment. If that didn't work, maybe a pilgrimage would. So now you're officially a doctor. You've got your robe, your leeches, your Latin phrases badly memorized, and a pocket full of dried herbs. You might not understand how the body works, but you've read enough to sound smart, and that's what counts. What's next? Patience, and they will come. Because people are always getting sick, especially in the Middle Ages, when bathing is suspicious, food is questionable, and rats are just part of the furniture. You'll be called to cottages and castles alike. Some patients will be poor peasants with fevers. Others will be wealthy nobles with bad digestion from eating too much boar. All will look to you with hope. You'll perform treatments you barely understand. Bleeding, purging, fumigating wounds with incense, prescribing wine mixed with ashes. Sometimes it helps. Sometimes the patient dies. Either way, you act like you expected it, and that, in essence, is how you become a medieval doctor, not by proving your skill, not by helping the sick recover, but by appearing to be a doctor long enough that nobody questions it. Your knowledge is shaky, your methods are messy, and your tools are terrifying. But in a world without germ theory, antibiotics, or anesthesia, you're the best hope most people have. And if that sounds gross, well, if medieval medicine had a mascot, it was probably Galen of Pergamon. He was the ancient Roman physician whose ideas dominated Western medical thought for well over 1,000 years. That's a long time for one guy's work to go unquestioned, especially considering Galen lived in the 2nd century AD, and most medieval doctors never actually read his original works. You'd think doctors would want to observe patients, test theories, and evolve their practices. But in the Middle Ages, medicine was about authority, not accuracy. Galen was considered the ultimate authority, which meant his writings weren't just suggestions, they were sacred. And here's the twist. They weren't even reading Galen directly. Most medieval doctors relied on Latin translations, often copied from Arabic translations, which were themselves translated from the original Greek. That's like trying to understand Shakespeare by reading a Google Translate version of a Korean version of a French adaptation. Naturally, things got lost in translation. Galen believed in the 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. He thought that keeping these in balance was the key to health. Sounds simple enough, but Galen's definitions were vague, philosophical, and based on observations of animals, not humans. That didn't stop medieval doctors from treating his theories like holy scripture. A headache? Too much yellow bile? Melancholy? Obviously an excess of black bile. Cough? Too much phlegm. High energy? Must be a blood imbalance. Get out the leeches. And that's where the real fun begins, because Galen wasn't exactly into evidence-based medicine. He had ideas, big, sweeping ideas about anatomy and bodily function. But when he dissected animals, mostly monkeys and pigs, he assumed they were close enough to humans. This led to a whole library of mistakes. For instance, Galen believed the heart had small holes between its chambers, letting blood pass freely. He also thought that venous blood was made in the liver and pumped by the veins, while arterial blood was a completely different substance filled with air and vital spirits. He was wrong, but for centuries no one corrected him. Why? Because the church, the universities, and medical guilds believed truth had already been discovered. The job of a doctor wasn't to find new truths, it was to interpret the old ones. Dissecting a human body was frowned upon, sometimes even considered a sin. And doctors who challenged Galen were seen as arrogant or even blasphemous. So instead of correcting Galen, they copied him, again and again. Manuscripts of Galen's writings were copied by hand, passed from scholar to scholar, often with added notes that introduced new errors. Some of these copies contradicted each other, but rather than sort it out, medieval doctors just mashed them together. The result? A confusing, contradictory, and wildly inaccurate medical worldview, all built on the faulty assumption that Galen had already figured everything out. And it didn't help that many medieval physicians barely practiced medicine in the way we think of it today. A lot of them never touched a patient. They were university men, learned in texts, fluent in Latin, but clueless about physical symptoms. When someone got sick, they didn't ask, "What are your symptoms?" They asked, "What did Galen say about this?" For example, fevers were almost always blamed on hot humors, especially in excess of blood. The treatment? Bloodletting. No matter the cause of the fever, malaria, infection, or something else, you were likely to have blood drained until you fainted. And if you died, well, you were just too imbalanced to be saved. Even surgical treatments were guided by Galenic ideas. He wrote extensively about anatomy, and surgeons based their procedures on these writings, despite the fact that Galen never dissected a single human cadaver. So, when real human bodies didn't match his descriptions, they assumed the bodies were wrong. Not Galen dot in some cases. If a cadaver showed a feature not mentioned by Galen, students would simply ignore it. Or worse, they cut the body in a way that made it match Galen's. Expectations. Confirmation bias. Medieval style. One of the more ironic details is that Galen himself was a pragmatist. He didn't see his ideas as perfect or eternal. He expected others to test, improve, and even disprove him. But that nuance got lost as his work became dogma. The turning point wouldn't come until the 16th century, when anatomists like Andreas Vesalius dared to challenge Galen by dissecting actual human bodies. Vesalius found dozens of Galen's mistakes. He published his findings in a revolutionary book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, and was met with shock, outrage, and accusations of sacrilege. But the damage had already been done. By the time of Vesalius, medieval doctors had spent centuries treating the sick based on deeply flawed ideas. And what did that mean for patients? It meant being subjected to endless bleeding, purging, cupping, and bizarre dietary restrictions. It meant doctors misdiagnosing infections as cold imbalances and prescribing hot poultices that made them worse. It meant dying slowly under the care of men who believed in Galen more than they believed in their own eyes. And yet, this system endured. Because once something becomes tradition, once it's taught in universities and written into law, it's hard to undo. Even when it's wronged out in a way, Galen wasn't the villain here. He was a brilliant thinker, doing the best he could in a world with no microscopes, no x-rays, and no germ theory. The real tragedy was how long Europe clung to his mistakes, afraid to question, afraid to change dots. So if you were a medieval doctor, your medical Bible was probably a mangled secondhand version of Galen misinterpreted, poorly copied, and several languages removed from the original. And if you were a medieval patient, your fate rested in the hands of someone who thought illness was caused by hot wind, trapped in your spleen. Let's take a moment to picture it. Your medical office. In the Middle Ages, it's not the clean, sterile clinic you might expect. There's no gleaming white tile, no stethoscope, no antiseptic smell wafting gently through the air. Instead, the scent that hits you first is something closer to a mix of dried blood, sour sweat, rotting herbs, and old meat. That's just the waiting room. Now, calling it an office might be generous. Most medieval doctors didn't have designated clinics like today's general practitioners. If you were wealthy, you might convert a room in your home into a study where patients could visit. If you were poor or more mobile, you likely traveled to your patients, dragging your gear behind you in a wooden chest or satchel. But let's assume you set up shop. Your room is dark. Windows are small and narrow, partly for defense and partly because glass is expensive and rare. A single candle or oil lamp might flicker near your wooden desk. Books, if you're literate and lucky, sit stacked nearby, often wrapped in cloth to keep dust and bugs out. And then there's the table. Not a surgical table. Mind you, just a flat wooden surface where people sit or lie down. Stained from years of use, covered in cloth that may or may not have been washed that year. There's a stool for you and a bucket nearby for, well, whatever needs catching. Vomit, pus, urine, it's a versatile piece of equipment, but the true centerpiece of the medieval doctor's space is his collection of tools. If you were expecting polished steel instruments and neatly organized drawers, I regret to inform you. It's a horror show. There are knives, some curved, some straight. A few are surgical, others just repurposed kitchen blades. You'll see bone saws, often large, rusty, and loud. Forceps made from iron, hooks, needles, and scalpels, all of them duller than they should be, but sharp enough to hurt. Leather straps, used to tie patients down during procedures. And then there's cautery iron, a long metal rod, heated. In fire until it glows red, used to sear wounds closed. None of these are clean. There's no soap, no rubbing alcohol, no antiseptic of any kind. Instruments are rarely washed between uses. If a blade is wiped, it's usually with a cloth already soaked in someone else's blood. The very idea of sterilization is unknown. Germs haven't been discovered. Infection is believed to be caused by bad air, not by bacteria. So, your tools marinate in disease between appointments, carrying illnesses from one patient to the next. Then there are your diagnostic instruments. A flask for collecting urine, possibly made of horn, glass, or clay. Charts that show what different urine colors might mean. Cloudy, reddish, brown, foamy. You might even have a spoon for tasting it, because yes, tasting urine was a legitimate diagnostic method. A trained physician could sip and say, yes, this is clearly a case of excessive phlegm. Next to your flasks are herbs, bundles of dried leaves, roots, and seeds. Some are wrapped in cloth. Others spill loosely into wooden bowls. You've got rosemary, sage, rue, and wormwood. Maybe a few exotic spices if you can afford them. Cloves, saffron. These serve as medicine, disinfectant, and sometimes just air freshener. You also have ointments and salves prepared by hand and stored in crude jars. They smell like old grease mixed with ash and garlic. There's goose fat, beeswax, lard, sometimes mixed with herbs or even crushed insects. You spread these on everything: burns, boils, wounds, rashes. If that doesn't work, you might move on to animal dung, human breast milk, or moldy bread. These are not desperate last resorts. They're standard practice. And then, of course, there are the leeches, kept in little jars, swimming in murky water. Leeches were used for bloodletting, especially when you needed to draw blood from delicate areas like the temples or fingers. They're applied directly to the skin, allowed to suck freely, and then either discarded or reused. Usually reused. Your work apron is stained. You might wear a robe or tunic, depending on your social status, but either way, it's probably covered in spots of blood, grease, and medicinal paste. Clean laundry is expensive. You get used to the smell. Let's talk about lighting. You don't have a surgical lamp or even a bright bulb. You have candles and oil lamps. The flame flickers. Shadows jump across the room. You squint over wounds, trying not to cut too deep or too shallow. Sometimes you do both. And then there's the sound. Screams during procedures are common. No anesthesia means patients feel everything. You might give them strong wine or a poppy-based drink, but it dulls the pain only slightly. Some patients faint. Others go into shock. And when you cauterize a wound, the sizzle of flesh mixes with the sharp, burnt smell that clings to your hands for days. If your practice is in a city, the air outside your room doesn't help much. Streets are lined with open gutters. Chamber pots are emptied from windows, and animals roam freely. The stench of refuse and rot floats in with the breeze. You might burn incense or herbs to mask it, which sometimes makes things worse hot. Herbal rot instead of cold, raw rot. The tools of your trade also reflect your worldview. Since disease is thought to be caused by imbalanced humors, bad air, or divine punishment, your equipment is designed not to kill germs, a concept unknown, but to balance, release, or exercise. You bleed to balance. You purge to release. You chant or use relics to drive out demons. And you do it all with grim determination because you believe this helps. Sometimes it even does. By accident, a wound gets wrapped tightly and heals. A herbal tea eases a stomach ache. A patient survives. Your reputation grows. You clean your tools, maybe. You burn a few more herbs. And the next patient walks in, sniffs the air, and lies down on that same splintery table. You wipe your hands on your apron, reach for the leeches, and get to work. This was medicine. Not clean, not kind, and definitely not comfortable. It was dark, smelly, sticky, loud, and if you were the doctor, it was your everyday life. This wasn't horror to you. It was routine. And while patients groaned, bled, and sometimes died on your table, you kept going because someone had to. If you've ever wondered how medieval doctors made decisions, how they knew what to treat, how to treat it, or whether to let nature take its course, it often came down to 4 fluids, not science, not observation, just 4 mysterious, ancient bodily fluids that supposedly governed all health and sickness. These were the 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. They were inherited from the ancient Greek medical tradition, most famously championed by Hippocrates and then Galen, and carried with religious devotion into the medieval world. In this view, your body wasn't just a biological machine. It was a sort of cosmic soup. And if your soup was off balance, you got sick. Let's break them down. Blood was hot and wet. It was associated with the heart and linked to vitality, youth, joy, and a ruddy complexion. Too much blood? You might be overly passionate, impulsive, or feverish. Yellow bile was hot and dry. Stored in the gallbladder, it represented anger, aggression, and liver disorders. Black bile was cold and dry. Tied to the spleen, it signified depression, melancholy, and digestive issues. Phlegm was cold and wet. It was seen as sluggishness, laziness, and chronic colds, and excess of phlegm. Meant you were pale, slow, or coughing a lot. So when you got sick, your doctor didn't ask, "What's the infection?" They asked, "Which humor is out of balance?" This wasn't a metaphor, it was the literal diagnosis. For example, if you had a fever, the diagnosis might be excess. Blood. You were too hot, too flushed, and clearly needed to be bled. And that leads us to the favorite treatment of the medieval world, bloodletting. Bloodletting was used for just about everything. Headaches? Bleed them. Cramps? Bleed. Toothache, gout, fever, melancholy, epilepsy, or even just being out of sorts, the answer was almost always to remove some blood. The logic was simple. If too much blood causes disease, removing some will restore balance. Never mind that the body is already very good at maintaining its own balance, that taking blood from a sick person weakens them further. Theory beat reality every time. Doctors use lancets, small, sharp knives, to make shallow incisions in veins, usually in the arm, leg, or neck. The amount of blood removed could range from a few ounces to pints. Some doctors had diagrams of the body that indicated where to cut for which symptoms. Trouble with your liver? Bleed from the right arm. Headache? Try the forehead. Madness? Bleed from the foot. For more delicate procedures, they used leeches, especially on the temples, eyelids, or other sensitive areas. These little bloodsuckers were a doctor's best friend. They were easy to apply, didn't require cutting, and gave the illusion of precision. Plus, they were reusable. Patients often fainted during or after the procedure. Blood loss, pain, dehydration. Fear it was a lot to handle. In some cases, the treatment killed the patient before the disease could. But doctors rarely blamed themselves. They just concluded that the imbalance was too severe. Other humor balancing methods included purging, vomiting, and sweating. If bloodletting didn't work, or if the humor in question was bile or phlegm, you'd be given emetics. Laxatives or hot baths? Sometimes all three in one day. Diet was also adjusted according to humors. Foods were assigned qualities like hot, cold, cold, dry, and moist. If your problem was excess coldness, say too much phlegm, your doctor might recommend warm, dry foods like roasted meats or spiced wine. But if your imbalance leaned hot, you might be told to avoid garlic, onions, or red wine. Some doctors even considered personality traits to be humor-based. If you were cheerful and energetic, you were probably sanguine, that is, full of blood. Melancholy people had too much black bile. Angry folks, clearly too much yellow bile. Phlegmatic types were calm, sleepy, and full of, you guessed, it dash found out so. Treatment wasn't just about symptoms. It was about you, your temperament, your complexion, the season, the weather, and the time of day. This made everything extremely complicated and inconsistent. Two people with identical symptoms might get completely different treatments because their doctors believed their inner fluids were different. There was no testing, no experimentation. No, let's see what works. Just a massive unshakable. Belief in balancing invisible fluids. The four humors theory wasn't just medical, it was philosophical. It was rooted in ancient ideas about harmony, balance, and nature. The body mirrored the universe. Health was balance. Disease was imbalance. And the doctor's job was to restore that natural order. There's a strange poetry to it. A certain logic if you squint. But in practical terms, it was a disaster. People with infections were bled until they could barely sit up. People with digestive issues were purged until they passed out. People with fevers were doused with cold water and then roasted in front of a fire. Every treatment carried risks. None of it was based on actual anatomy, physiology, or observation. And yet the four humors dominated for over 1,000 years. From the fall of Rome to the dawn of modern science, they were the guiding principle for nearly every medical decision in Europe. Why? Because challenging them meant challenging everything, the church, the universities, and the ancient authors. No one wanted to poke holes in Galen, and so patients continued to be bled, purged, and starved in the name of balance. Even as the Renaissance approached and new ideas began to stir, the four humors lingered. Some doctors clung to them into the 18th century. A few rural folk traditions held on even longer. Today, the idea seems ridiculous. But for centuries, it was not only believed, it was respected. Learned men in robes debated humoral balance as seriously as we now debate climate policy. They weren't fools. They were doing their best with the ideas they had, ideas that just happened to be wrong. So if you were a patient in the medieval world, chances are good you were diagnosed with an imbalance of fluids you couldn't see. You were treated with methods that made you weaker, and you probably paid for the privilege. Your doctor stood over you, robe swaying, lancet in hand, chanting softly in Latin as your blood spilled into a clay bowl. You hope you'd feel better tomorrow, Doc, or at least well-balanced. There's something oddly poetic about medieval medicine. It was deeply spiritual, rooted in classical philosophy, and filled with elegant Latin terminology. But then, at the heart of it all, your doctor would take a long look at your pee, maybe even a sip, and follow it up by digging through your stool with a stick. Welcome to the glamorous world of medieval diagnosis. When a patient complained of any illness fever, fatigue, rashes, or something more terrifying like a mysterious swelling, one of the first things a doctor wanted was a sample. But not a blood sample or a swab or a temperature reading. What they needed was your urine, carefully collected in a flask, and ideally fresh. Enter the urinal, not the modern kind, but a clear flask, shaped a bit like a round-bottomed bottle with a narrow neck. These glass vessels were symbols of the medical profession. In fact, doctors were sometimes mocked for carrying them around everywhere, like wizards carrying potions. Urinalysis, as it was called, was considered a refined and scholarly practice. A skilled doctor could supposedly diagnose dozens of conditions just by examining the color, smell, clarity, sediment, and even taste of a patient's pee, and they took it very seriously. Medieval medical texts included color charts comparing the hue of urine to everything from wine to wheat to river mud. Pale yellow suggested a cold imbalance. Dark reddish urine might mean excessive heat in the liver. Cloudy urine indicated bad digestion. Frothy urine, probably too much phlegm. Doctors would hold the flask up to the light and gently swirl it. They might warm it slightly to release odors. Then they'd sniff it, and if they were very committed, dip a pinky in and taste a drop. Was this a reliable diagnostic method? Not really. Most interpretations were based on humoral theory, not biological evidence. But it made doctors feel like scholars. They weren't poking patients with sticks or staring at their tongues. They were interpreting fluids. It felt sophisticated. Then, of course, came the stool inspection, because what goes in must come out, and what comes out is very telling. In a world without x-rays or lab tests, feces were sometimes the only physical evidence of what was happening inside a patient's body. So, naturally, medieval doctors examined it. This didn't mean they all stuck their hands in the latrine. But it wasn't uncommon to receive a container with the patient's sample. Just like with urine, stool was judged by color, consistency, smell, and sometimes presence of worms or mucus. A well-formed, light brown stool meant the patient was digesting properly. Watery or greenish waste suggested phlegmatic imbalances. Or cold in the stomach if it was black and tarry. That could indicate burning in the spleen or too much bile in rare cases. If a doctor was truly determined or just overly curious, they might dissect a particularly troubling stool. Tools like small spatulas, sticks, or spoons were used to poke through the mess. Looking for worms, undigested food, or ominous black clots. This wasn't done as a side hobby. It was a respected part of the diagnostic process. Learned texts described how to interpret various textures and smells. One French physician even created a stool smell chart, listing dozens of unique odor profiles and their corresponding illnesses. And if you're wondering, yes, taste was occasionally involved here. 2. Not common, not popular. But there are recorded cases where doctors tasted stool to determine bitterness, sweetness, or sourness. It was considered the mark of a truly dedicated physician. Or perhaps one with very little self-preservation instinct. All. Of this pee tasting, poo sniffing, texture analysis was meant to build a diagnostic picture of the patient. Combine that with humoral theory, a quick glance at the patient's tongue, and a few probing questions, and the doctor could prescribe a course of treatment. Bleed a little. Eat less garlic, maybe pray more. There was even a market for fake urine. Samples. If a nobleman was too embarrassed to discuss his condition, he might send a servant to the doctor with a flask of urine. Problem was that servant might just pee into the bottle himself. Some apothecaries even sold counterfeit urine. To spare clients the indignity, doctors would then diagnose and prescribe based on entirely unrelated bodily fluids. One of the stranger practices was the urine wheel. This was a colorful circular chart that helped doctors identify diseases by matching the color of a patient's. Urine with symbols and handwritten notes. There were even portable versions like medieval flip books of disease diagnosis. Now, all of this may sound absurd. Why taste someone's pee when you could just ask how they feel? But in the Middle Ages, most patients couldn't describe their symptoms in clinical terms. They didn't know how to articulate pressure in the abdomen or shortness of breath. They just said, I feel heavy, or my blood is sluggish. Doctors needed external signs to make their best guesses, and fluids were reliable. Everybody pees. Everybody poops. So it became the cornerstone of medieval diagnostics. You can almost imagine the scene. A patient hands over a warm flask of golden liquid. The doctor, eyes narrowed in deep concentration, holds it to the candlelight, swirls it, inhales deeply, and murmurs something in Latin. Then he gestures to a servant who produces a second container, heavier, darker, and unmistakably pungent. The doctor frowns, pokes it with a stick, Maybe even brings it closer to his nose. After a moment of tense silence, he looks up and says, "You must have slept with your windows open. The cold air has entered your liver." That was enough to justify leeches, vomit-inducing potions, and days of dietary restrictions. Because the P said so. This blend of guesswork, tradition, and bodily fluids wasn't unique to the West either. Islamic, Indian, and Chinese medical traditions also analyzed urine and stool, but often with more nuance, more herbal insight, and less licking. Still, in Europe, these methods held on for centuries. Even after the humoral theory began to decline, urinalysis remained a popular diagnostic technique well into the 17th and 18th centuries. It took the rise of microscopy, chemistry, and modern pathology to finally replace sniff and sip with something more scientific. But for the medieval doctor, this was your daily grind. Jars of bodily fluids, charts stained with candle wax and fingerprints, tables with smudges from more than just ink. You weren't just a healer. You were a fluid analyst, a smell interpreter, a poo philosopher. You might not have understood bacteria, but you believed in the wisdom of the body. And you thought that if you stared at someone's urine long enough, it would tell you the truth. Sometimes it did. Most times it didn't, but it was all you had. Imagine being a medieval doctor. You wake up before dawn in a creaky wooden bed, your robe still stiff from yesterday's sweat, ointments, and maybe a splash of something less identifiable. A servant may bring you stale bread and watered wine, and before the sun has even crested the horizon, your day begins. You don't have a clinic where patients line up politely. There are no waiting rooms with magazines, no receptionists scribbling down appointments. Instead, your entire medical practice is mobile. You go where the sick are, whether it's a lord's manor on the hill or a thatched hut sinking into a muddy village path. This is the art of the medieval house call, and it's brutal. Let's start with your deer. You don't have a sleek black bag with a monogram on the side. Your tools are packed into a wooden box, a leather satchel, or a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, you've got your scalpels, lancets, clamps, cautery irons, jars of herbs, dried leeches. In a gourd, a handful of vials with mysterious powders, a flask or two for urine samples, and perhaps a thick book or two filled with Galenic wisdom. These are heavy. And the roads are bad. In summer, they're dust and rocks. In winter, they become freezing rivers of sludge. You might ride a horse if you're lucky, or a mule if you're poorer. Otherwise, it's your feet doing the work, your boots sinking. In the mud, your bag thudding against your hip with every painful step. You visit everyone. From the well-fed nobility who can afford to pay you in coin or silk, to the peasant who trades you a chicken and a prayer. The difference in lifestyle between patients is staggering. One day you might find yourself in a manor, attending to a baron who complains of melancholy and has his servants bring you his fresh urine in a polished flask. The next, you're crouched in a one-room cottage where 8 people sleep in the same bed, and the patient is a child coughing blood into a straw mattress stuffed with haydat in a manner. Things might feel almost civilized. You'll be served wine. You'll examine the patient on clean linen sheets. And if the Lord likes you, you may be fed meat and pastries before you leave. Of course, if your diagnosis displeases him, if his favorite hound dies or his gout gets worse, you might be whipped, dismissed, or worse, in the peasant's hovel. There's no such ceremony. Chickens roam indoors. The fire smokes endlessly. The air is thick with damp, dung, and desperation. You crouch beside the patient and try not to step on the family's only goat, which lives indoors during winter to keep warm. The treatment doesn't vary much. Regardless of social status, you apply the same principles. Check their pulse. Inspect their urine, sniff the air, glance at the moon chart you carry, and decide which humor is acting up. If they're feverish, you may bleed them right there. With chickens watching, if they're constipated, you give them an herbal laxative that will keep them moaning into a bucket for hours. And always, you leave some advice. Eat less fish. Burn rosemary. Pray to Saint Sebastian. Avoid cold air. And don't eat cheese after sunset. You don't linger. You have miles to go and other patients to see. Some doctors see a dozen people. A day more if plague is in the air. And that means no rest, no washing of tools between visits, and little time for sleep. Your meals are scraps eaten on horseback or a cold hunk of bread by candlelight dot. Sometimes you're summoned in the night. A servant bangs on your door, breathless, begging you to come immediately. His master is dying. You dress half asleep. Grab your bag, light a torch, and stumble into the dark. You might ride for hours only to arrive and find the patient already dead. You bow, say a few words, and then try not to fall asleep on the ride back. You treat not just people, but their homes, too. You might recommend hanging herbs in doorways to purify the air. Burning sulfur in rooms. Rearranging beds to face the right direction according to planetary alignment. Your job isn't just to heal, it's to restore balance. Inside and out, sometimes you're not even welcome. In remote villages, people may fear you. A stranger in dark robes, muttering Latin, bleeding people and burning wounds with hot iron. To some, you're a witch. To others, a con artist. There are stories of doctors being run out of towns, stoned or tied up and left in the woods. A bad diagnosis can lose you a client. A wrong guess can lose you your life. But still, you do the rounds. Because that's the work. You don't heal many, but you show up. You drag your muddy boots from manor to mud hut, armed with your rusty knives, and your urine flasks. You carry both fear and hope on your shoulders. And you do it all while catching fleas from bedding and holding your breath through the worst smells you've ever known. The medieval house call wasn't noble. It wasn't luxurious. It was filthy, dangerous, thankless, and often pointless. But it was essential. In a world where hospitals were rare, where people feared leaving their homes, where disease could strike a family and wipe out 3 generations in a week, someone had to go, and that someone. Would you die being a medieval doctor on an ordinary? Day was bad. Being one during the plague was another level of horror entirely. It wasn't just dangerous. It was suicidal. You didn't treat the plague. You watched it. You smelled it. You heard it in the coughing, the weeping, the screaming, and then, very quickly, the silence. Plague was the moment every doctor dreaded, and rightly so. Because when the plague arrived, you were expected to stay. While nobles and merchants fled to the countryside, doctors were pressured by civic duty, religion, or desperate townsfolk to remain among the dying. Most didn't want to. Many didn't. The lucky ones left early and fast. But those who stayed found themselves trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The most infamous plague. The Black Death struck Europe in the mid-14th century and killed as much as half the population. But outbreaks recurred for centuries. Every few years, a town or city would be hit again, fewer deaths perhaps, but no less fear. When plague arrived, it was unmistakable. The symptoms were horrifying. High fever, vomiting, confusion, and the signature buboes painful swellings in the armpits, neck, and groin that turned black and oozed. Sometimes the infected coughed up blood. Death could come in a matter of hours. As a doctor, you had no idea what caused it. Germ theory didn't exist. Bacteria were invisible. You believed in bad air or miasma, invisible, poisonous vapors that drifted through towns and seeped into the lungs. You blamed planetary alignments, earthquakes, divine punishment, or corrupted humors. You blamed everything except rats. And fleas, which were the real culprits. With so little knowledge, your treatments were desperate and experimental. You might apply poultices to the buboes, onions, herbs, crushed emeralds, or dried toad powder. You might lance the buboes and burn the wound with hot irons. Some doctors wrapped patients in vinegar-soaked cloths or forced them to drink mercury. Some bled them. Some prayed. Most just waited. Nothing worked. Absolutely nothing. The bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. In cities, carts went street by street, collecting the dead. In villages, people simply locked their doors and waited for the end. Dogs and pigs roamed the streets, sometimes gnawing at corpses. And you, the doctor, walked into homes where entire families lay dead or dying. Children clung to their mothers, who had already stopped breathing. A husband sat slumped at the hearth, while his wife moaned behind a curtain, her face covered in boils. You stood in the middle of it all, unsure what to do, how to help, or even how to breathe. You tried to protect yourself. Doctors began wearing plague masks, those long, bird-like beaked hoods stuffed with aromatic herbs and sponges. The belief was that sweet-smelling items could filter out the deadly miasma. You looked like a monstrous crow, but at least you had some barrier between you and the pestilence. These costumes became iconic. Long robes of wax fabric, gloves, boots, a cane to prod bodies without touching them. You were fully covered, head to toe, in what amounted to medieval PPE. Did it work? Not really. But it was better than nothing. Even more terrifying was the realization that your presence might make things worse. With no way to disinfect your tools or clothes, you often carried the plague from one house to another. Your good intentions became a death sentence. Some towns attempted quarantines. You were ordered to examine the sick and mark their doors with red paint or crosses. You might help enforce curfews, restrict travel, or write lists of the dead. Your job expanded beyond medicine. You became part of the mechanics of dying. Morale crumbled. Churches rang funeral bells all day, every day. Monks gave last rites until they themselves collapsed. Gravediggers died in the middle of their work. And you, the doctor, continued to make your rounds with numb fingers and a churning stomach. Sometimes, you were hired by towns specifically to be a plague doctor. It came with a salary, housing, and a contract, but it also came with certain death. Most plague doctors didn't survive the outbreaks they were paid to manage. But they were always more willing to try out of desperation, ambition, or sheer hope that they'd be the one who lived. What made it worse was the loneliness. No one wanted to be near you, not even your family. You smelled of vinegar, blood, and death. You came home at night, pulled off your plague mask, and stared into a bowl of cold stew alone, and mental toll was unimaginable. Day after day. You witnessed unspeakable suffering. You touched hands that were already cooling. You delivered bad news over and over until you stopped using words. You watched children die first, then parents, then neighbors. Your prayers stopped feeling like hope and started feeling like apology. Eventually it would stop. The air would clear. The fever would fade from the town. Survivors would creep back into the streets, blinking in the sunlight, searching for signs of life, but you would never be the same. You'd bury your plague robes or burn them. You clean your instruments, not to sterilize, but just to scrape off the memories. And you'd begin again, one patient, one urine flask, one wound at a time. Being a medieval doctor during the plague wasn't heroic. It wasn't noble. It was horrifying, thankless, and nearly always fatal. You didn't save lives. You witnessed death over and over until you either joined it or staggered away, broken and haunted. And yet, someone had to do it. Let's say you're a medieval peasant. One day, while chopping wood or wrangling a stubborn pig, you slip and badly injure your leg. Or maybe you develop a festering abscess, a hernia, or something awful that's been leaking. For days, there are no hospitals nearby, no antiseptic, no anesthesia. What do? You call the surgeon a man who is usually not a doctor at all. Just a barber with a knife. That's right. In medieval Europe, barber surgeons were the ones who cut you open, stitched you shut, and hoped you wouldn't die from the experience. They were considered lower in status than physicians. Physicians diagnosed illnesses, examined urine, and quoted Galen. Surgeons, on the other hand, dealt with blood, pus, and pain. They were the blue-collar workers of the medical world, practical, messy, and often terrifying. These men had no formal training. They learned by watching and doing apprenticeships, battlefield experience, and a great deal of improvisation. The tools of the trade were simple and brutal. Knives, saws, hooks, hammers, and tongs. Everything was made of metal and wood. Everything was reused. Nothing was sterilized. Let's walk through what a surgery might look like. You arrive limping, pale, maybe feverish. The surgeon looks at your wound, nods, and says it needs to be opened. There's no waiting room, no forms to sign. You lie down on a wooden table or in poorer areas, the dirt floor. If you're lucky, someone hands you a leather strap to bite down on. Or better yet, a big mug of alcohol-strong wine, bitter beer, or whatever local brew can take the edge off your terror. No one will put you to sleep. You'll be wide awake the whole time. The surgeon grabs a blade, still crusted with something from the last patient, and starts cutting. There is no finesse, no pre-op briefing. Just slicing into you as fast as possible before you pass out, or bleed out. Blood gushes. You scream. The room smells like iron and sweat and fear. The surgeon reaches in with bare fingers or tongs, pulls out whatever's infected or broken, maybe cauterizes the wound with a red-hot iron, and then stitches. It closed with catgut or coarse thread dot, no gloves. No disinfectant. No concept of germs. The goal isn't precision, it's speed. The faster the cut, the better your chances of survival. Sometimes surgery meant amputation. A crushed leg, an infected arm, these weren't salvageable. They were liabilities. So out came the bone saw, and the limb was removed in under 2 minutes if the surgeon was skilled. Tourniquets were crude. Bleeding was constant. And the pain unimaginable. The patient usually passed out from shock or blood loss. That was, in some ways, a mercy. After surgery, your chances weren't great. Without antibiotics or antiseptics, infection was almost inevitable. Wounds festered. Gangrene set in. Flies laid eggs in the bandages. Fever took hold. Within days, you might be dead. And if you survived, you were left with scars, stiffness, and constant pain. But surgery wasn't always hopeless. Some patients did recover, especially from things like abscesses, boils, or arrow wounds. Surgeons became adept at extracting foreign objects, arrowheads, teeth, shrapnel from battlefield injuries, and in rare cases, even trepanation drilling. A hole into the skull to release pressure or evil spirits was performed. Yes, people lived through that. Surgeons also performed cataract surgery. Not modern laser techniques, of course. They used a needle-like instrument to push the cloudy lens of the eye down and out of the way. This left the patient with blurry vision, but better than total blindness. The procedure was called couching. Brutal, but sometimes effective. There were surgical manuals often illustrated in lurid detail. Some of these include full diagrams of wounds, procedures, and tools. One famous book by Guy de Chauliac, a 14th century French physician, became the standard for surgical knowledge across Europe. But again, it was all based on observation and tradition, not science so much dependent on luck. The cleanliness of the environment, the strength of your constitution, the steadiness of the surgeon's hands. One slip could end your life. And even success was often judged by survival, not recovery. If you didn't die immediately, the surgery was a success. And what about pain management? The medieval world had herbal remedies, opium poppies, mandrake root, hemlock, alcohol, belladonna. But dosage was tricky. Too little, and it did nothing. Too much, and you stopped breathing. Most surgeons preferred a good strong drink and someone to hold the patient down. Some patients begged to be knocked unconscious. Others recited prayers through the ordeal. Others simply screamed. And the operating space? Often a dimly lit room. In a cottage or the corner of a monastery. No special ventilation. No surgical gowns. Blood stained the floor. Flies buzzed. Family members wept nearby. The smell of burning flesh from cauterization filled the air. It's no surprise that many people avoided surgery at all costs. Better to live with a limp than risk death on a blood-soaked table. And yet, for some, there was no choice. The pain was too great, the infection too severe, and so they submitted themselves to the knife. For the surgeon, it was a dirty job, a thankless job, and rarely a rewarding one. He wasn't praised, he wasn't celebrated. He was tolerated till something went wrong. Then he was blamed, sued, or beaten, or worse yet, somehow surgery persisted. Because even in the Middle Ages, when knowledge was limited and danger was high, people still clung to hope. The hope that someone with a steady hand and a sharp blade could cut away the pain. Sometimes they did. Sometimes they didn't. But in either case, you'd be lucky to have a lot of wine and very little memory. If you were to step into a medieval surgeon's workspace, you might expect to find some kind of sterile, order-neat rows of instruments, gleaming in the sunlight, each one carefully cleaned and arranged. But this is not a modern hospital. This is a world where the tools of healing are indistinguishable from the tools of horror. The instruments of medieval medicine were basic, crude, and often filthy. They were made from iron, bronze, or brass metals, prone to rust, corrosion, and general unpleasantness. There were no disinfectants, no autoclaves, no scrubbing protocols. If a tool worked once, it would be used again and again until it broke, dulled beyond use, or got lost inside a patient. Let's begin with the knives and scalpels. Every medieval doctor or barber surgeon carried a collection of blades. Long, short, curved, straight, some thin like razors, others thick like meat cleavers. They weren't shiny. They weren't sharp in the modern sense, but they were sharp enough to cut flesh, which was all that mattered. If you needed to bleed a patient, common practice for nearly every ailment, you'd use a lancet or flame. These were small, triangular blades, often with ornate handles, used to slice open a vein just enough to let the blood pour out. There were even multi-blade fleams for efficiency. Stab once, bleed fast. For amputations, the favorite tool was the bone saw. Thick, toothed, and heavy, it resembled a carpenter's saw more than a surgical instrument. It wasn't used gently. It was pressed to the limb and dragged back and forth until bone, muscle, and skin all gave way. Sometimes the surgeon needed help and assistant to hold the patient still while he worked quickly. Before the screaming became unbearable, for wound cauterization, there were branding irons. These were long rods with metal tips that were heated in a fire until glowing red. Pressed directly onto open wounds, they would seal blood vessels by burning them closed. The pain was excruciating. The smell was unforgettable. Next came forceps. Used for pulling teeth, bullets, or infected tissue. Most resembled crude pliers strong enough to grab, twist, and remove, but without any finesse. When pulling a tooth, the forceps often removed part of the jaw or broke surrounding teeth. Precision was not the point. If you were unlucky enough to need bladder stone surgery, your surgeon would reach for a lithotomy scoop. This was a small, sharp-edged spoon designed to dig into the bladder and extract stones. The process involved cutting into the perineum and poking around until something solid was found and removed. Recovery was rare. Pain was guaranteed. And then there were tree-fine circular saw-like tools used for drilling into the skull. This process, called trepanation, was used to relieve pressure, remove bone fragments, or exorcise spirits. The tool had a crank handle and sharp teeth. One wrong move, and you might cure a headache by ending the patient's life entirely. Sutures were done with curved needles and gut string, literally made from animal intestines. The stitching process was fast and rough. No anesthesia. No antiseptic. Just jab, pull, tie, and hope for the best. Leech jars were common too. These small glass or clay pots were filled with squirming leeches used for bloodletting. The doctor would apply a few to the patient's skin and wait as they fed. Once engorged, they'd be pulled off and reused later. Yes, reused. There was no concern for cross-contamination between patients. Even diagnostic tools were horrifying. A physician's most trusted device might be a spoon for examining pus or stirring mixtures, or a urine flask used to inspect the color, clarity, and sediment of the patient's pee. Some had scent sticks, dipped in different substances to test the strength of a patient's breath. The tools were not only reused, they were rarely cleaned. In wealthier towns, a surgeon might rinse his instruments in wine or vinegar. In poorer places, tools were simply wiped on a cloth and stuffed back in a bag. Blood dried on metal, rust spread, Infection became the real killer. Storage was rudimentary. Instruments were carried in rolls of leather, wrapped in cloth, or jumbled in a wooden box. If you were traveling, these tools bounced and clattered. At your side as you trudged through town to your next patient, the quality of tools varied wildly. Some were beautifully crafted by skilled blacksmiths, engraved, balanced, even decorated. Others were cobbled together from household items or repurposed farming tools. A sharp chisel might become a tree fine. A fishhook might be bent into a suture needle. Innovation was born from necessity and desperation. Did the doctors and surgeons know their tools were dangerous? Not entirely. They didn't understand germs. They thought infection came from imbalanced humors or bad air. A rusty blade didn't look deadly. It looked well used. A blood-stained clamp was proof of experience. Not failure, in fact. Some believed that pain was necessary for healing. That the body needed to suffer in order to purge illness. A clean, sharp tool wasn't a concern. Only speed, force, and faith. Of course, patients didn't see it that way. The moment the doctor opened his bag and revealed the cold, glinting metal, fear took over. People crossed themselves. Some fainted. Others fled. But if the pain was great enough, if the limb was rotten, the boil unbearable, the tooth throbbing, they stayed. And they submitted to the tools. Because for all their flaws, for all the rust and blood and failure, these tools were hope. Hope. That something could be cut away, pulled out, cauterized, or stitched shut. Hope that pain might give way to healing. Hope that survival was possible. And so the surgeon wiped his blade, dipped it in wine, and began again. Not because he believed in miracles, though some did, but because someone had to try no matter how crude the tools. No matter how many times they'd been used. No matter how many stains they carried in the medieval world, if you were lucky, enough to have survived the blade, the leech, or the burning iron, your next stop on the bumpy road to recovery was the apothecary. But don't imagine a tidy pharmacy with sterile counters and precise pill bottles. Instead, picture a dark, cluttered shop filled with shelves groaning under jars of powders, dried frogs, snake skins, and suspiciously labeled concoctions that smelled like a curse. The apothecary's shelf was not a place of certainty. It was a realm of guesswork, guided by tradition, hearsay, ancient texts, and the occasional divine whisper. For a medieval doctor or for a patient desperate enough to try anything, it was both hope and hazard in powdered form. The line between medicine and poison was razor thin, and sometimes non-existent. Let's start with the basics. Most medicines were made from plants' roots, leaves, seeds, flowers, bark, and resins. Some were common herbs you'd recognize today. Rosemary, sage, chamomile, lavender. Others were more questionable, like henbane, belladonna, or mandrake, which were known to be hallucinogenic and highly toxic, but also considered useful in small, unmeasured doses. Then there were animal-based remedies. Dried toad, powdered stag, horn, fox fat, bile, crushed ants, earthworms, bat blood, and the occasional human bone. Yes, human bone. Apothecaries often ground the bones of executed criminals into dust and sold it as a cure for epilepsy. Cannibal medicine was not only accepted, it was popular. Everything had a purpose. Or rather, everything was believed to have a purpose. You had a cough? Boil crushed mustard seed in goat milk and drink it warm. Plagued by melancholy? Try syrup. Of poppies mixed with ground pearls? Suffering from indigestion? Eat a spoonful of powdered oyster shell. Got the plague? Rub crushed emerald paste on your chest. Drink garlic wine. And pray. The apothecary's shelves were packed with mystery and confidence. And what couldn't be explained was simply given a Latin name and trusted all the more. A jar might be labeled Aqua Vita, Water of Life, though it might contain something indistinguishable from perfume, vinegar, or poorly distilled brandy. Measurement was an art, not a science. A dose could be as much as a hazelnut or the size of a pigeon's eye. Some recipes specified the phase of the moon, the direction of stirring, or the number of times a charm must be spoken while grinding ingredients. And who made these recipes? Some came from ancient Roman texts, especially Galen and Dioscorides. Others were passed down orally from master to apprentice. Many were copied from medieval herbals illustrated books that included advice like for snakebite. Apply crushed garlic and recite the Lord's Prayer backwards. It wasn't all madness. Some treatments genuinely worked. Honey, for instance, had antibacterial properties. Willow bark contained salicin, basically aspirin. Mint soothed the stomach. But for every effective remedy, there were dozens that were inert, absurd, or dangerous. Consider mercury. It was used to treat syphilis and skin diseases. Patients were advised to inhale mercury vapors or rub mercury ointments into their skin. The results were often fatal, but since the diseases were usually fatal too, the logic went, why not? Then there was arsenic. In small doses, it was thought to balance the humors. In larger doses, it balanced your life into death, but the apothecary's shelf didn't come with warning labels. Everything was medicine. Until the WSN single quotes T. Many apothecaries were also involved in alchemy, the attempt to transform substances, extend life, or create the philosopher's stone. Their shops were filled not just with medicines, but with glowing flasks, bubbling pots, smoky fires, and cryptic diagrams. Sometimes it was hard to tell where medicine ended and magic began. This blend of science and sorcery made people both trust and fear apothecaries. On one hand, they offered cures. On the other, they mixed powders that could kill silently. Some apothecaries were accused of poisoning, witchcraft, or heresy. Others were revered as miracle workers. Reputation was everything and often unstable. And yet, for all this chaos, most doctors relied heavily on the apothecary. Physicians would write prescriptions, and apothecaries would fill them, though whether they followed instructions accurately was anyone's guess. Communication between them was minimal, and competition was fierce. In some towns, apothecaries and doctors openly despised each other, accusing one another of fraud, incompetence, or greed. Patients, of course, were caught in the middle, desperate, confused, and often illiterate. They put their trust in the mysterious jars and powders handed to them with a smile and a vague nod. They swallowed what they were given, smeared what they were told, and hoped their sickness would pass. Apothecaries also made plague remedies, most famously four thieves' vinegar, a blend of herbs and garlic steeped in vinegar and worn in masks to ward off disease. It probably didn't work, but it smelled powerful, and that was half the battle. Some recipes aimed for comfort. Herbal teas for sleep, powders to calm hysteria, salves for skin rashes. In this, apothecaries were like early therapists, half pharmacologist, half folk healer. They sold hope in a jar dot, so the apothecary's shelf was a strange place, a place of dusty wisdom and dangerous miracles. It was where dried beetles sat next to powdered pearls, where lead and lavender shared a shelf, where healing and harm were measured with the same crooked spoon, and where, if you weren't careful, the cure just might outdo the disease. If your body was sick in the Middle Ages, things were bad. But if your mind was unwell, if you suffered from confusion, hallucinations, deep sadness, wild mood swings, or irrational behavior, your fate was even more uncertain. Because medieval mental health care wasn't just primitive, it was a strange and dangerous mix of religion, fear, superstition, and pain to begin with. There was no clear distinction between mental illness and spiritual possession. If you heard voices, they weren't a sign of schizophrenia. They were interpreted as the whisperings of demons or sometimes saints. If you wept uncontrollably, had intense mood swings, or couldn't get out of bed, you were not seen as depressed. You were thought to be either sinful, cursed, or weak in the soul. Doctors of the time, when confronted with these symptoms, relied not on therapy or medication, but on prayer, confession, and punishment. The idea was that a sick mind could be healed by treating the soul. If you were suffering, it was your fault or your family's or the devil's. Either way, the treatment would not be kind. For the wealthy, options included long stays in monasteries or religious houses where monks or nuns would pray over you. Offer spiritual advice and encourage fasting. You might be bled to rebalance your humors, or given herbal teas to induce vomiting or sleep. The idea was to purge whatever imbalance had taken hold of your mind. But for the poor, or for those considered dangerous, treatment was far more brutal. One common remedy for madness was trepanning, the act of drilling a hole into the skull to release the evil forces believed to be trapped inside. A crude circular blade was spun by hand until it cut through the bone, exposing the brain beneath. The patient was rarely sedated. Pain was seen as a part of the cure. If they survived, it was considered proof the procedure had worked. If they didn't, well, the demon was gone either way. Other treatments were no less harsh. Patients might be chained in cellars, flogged to drive out the devil, or subjected to public humiliation. It was thought that shock and shame might return the person to reason. Some were forced to sleep in churches, spend days in darkness, or wear iron chains during the day and night. This was not therapy. It was control and fear. Even language reveals the cruelty. There was no soft terminology or mental health. The mad, the lunatics, the possessed, these were not patients. They were threats to order, objects of curiosity, warnings to others. If someone had a seizure in the street, people threw holy water at them. If a woman spoke too freely or defied authority, she might be accused of hysteria, a diagnosis that implied her womb had wandered through. Her body had disrupted her brain. The treatment? Smoke, strong smells, or pressing objects against her body to guide the womb back into place. And yet, for all this horror, there were flickers of understanding. Some physicians and monks recognized patterns in mental illness. They saw that grief could cause madness, that starvation and poverty made minds fragile, that love lost or wars fought left invisible scars. They tried, in their own limited ways, to help with soft voices, calm environments, and patience. But such compassion was rare. Hospitals, when they existed, were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were more like holding places run by the church. Beds lined long stone halls. The mad were fed, clothed, and prayed over, but there was little treatment. Mostly, they were separated from society for everyone's comfort. The famous hospital Bethlehem in London, later known as Bedlam, became notorious for its cruel and chaotic treatment of the mentally ill. By the late Middle Ages, it was not uncommon for the public to visit just to watch the patients laughing, shouting, throwing coins. Madness was a spectacle, a kind of warning. A living cautionary tale about medieval mental health care was also deeply tied to astrology. A physician might consult the stars before diagnosing a patient's madness. Saturn in the wrong house, that explained your melancholy. A bad conjunction of Mars and the moon, clearly you were at risk of violence. Treatment, therefore, sometimes waited for the right planetary alignment. And so, mental illness became a tangle of faith, fear, fate, and failure. A woman who mourned too long might be accused of witchcraft. A soldier with nightmares might be called cursed. A child with epilepsy might be hidden from the neighbors for fear of shame. Silence surrounded these conditions, not understanding. Some people lived entire lives in this fog of misunderstanding. They were pitied or punished, but rarely helped. And if they spoke about what they felt about the voices, the sadness, the fear of those words were often used against them. And yet some did find peace. In quiet corners of monasteries, among compassionate healers, or through the gentle rituals of daily life, there were those who were cared for, not cured. The difference was subtle but important, and it was rare. So if you had a troubled mind in the medieval world, your path was steep and dark. You were more likely to be feared than loved, more likely to be restrained than understood. And if your suffering couldn't be seen, couldn't be touched or measured, it was rarely believed that the tree-panning drill sat ready. The priest stood nearby, and the prayers began again, not always for healing, sometimes just for silence. In the Middle Ages, becoming a doctor wasn't about passing rigorous exams, earning a license, or completing years of clinical internships. It was mostly about confidence, connections, and a strong stomach. Because the path to becoming a medieval physician, surgeon, or apothecary wasn't so much a straight line as a chaotic tangle of guesswork, tradition, and sometimes outright fraud. Let's start with the most respectable kind of doctor, the physician. These men were at the top of the medieval medical hierarchy. They were educated, literate, and trained in Latin, but that didn't mean they had actually touched a sick person. In fact, most physicians never performed surgeries. They didn't even like to get their hands dirty. Their job was to read ancient texts, analyze urine samples, and prescribe treatments based on the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. To become a physician, one usually had to attend university, but not in the way we understand it now. Medieval universities were places of philosophy, theology, and rhetoric. Medicine was largely book-based. Students memorized the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna. Anatomy was discussed, not practiced. Dissection was rare and often banned, so most physicians graduated knowing more about Aristotle than the human body. Their tools? Books, charts, a fancy robe, maybe a urine wheel for diagnosing diseases by color and smell. But if a patient needed surgery, or an infected wound drained, or a limb amputated, that's where the surgeons came in. Now, surgeons were seen as a lower class of healer. They weren't university trained. Many were barbers, trained in the art of shaving heads, setting bones, lancing boils, and bleeding veins. To become a surgeon, you didn't need literacy or degrees. You needed hands-on experience, usually gained through apprenticeships. You learn by doing on wounded soldiers, on accident victims, on anyone desperate enough to let you try. Surgeons carried their tools in leather rolls. They traveled from town to town, offering their services. Some became well-known and respected. Others were barely a step above butchers. But all of them shared a common trait. They worked quickly, violently, and without anesthesia. To succeed, you didn't need theory. You needed speed and the ability to ignore screaming. Then there were the apothecaries. They weren't quite doctors, and they weren't quite merchants, but they were essential. Apothecaries made and sold medicines, herb, powders, tinctures, syrups, pills, ointments, and more. They often worked independently or in tandem with physicians. And while some had formal training, many learned their craft through apprenticeship, handed down from master to student to become an apothecary. You needed a nose for herbs, a talent for mixing, and sometimes a knack for alchemy. You also needed a good memory, because dosages were rarely written down and often lethal if mismeasured. But apothecaries were also businessmen. They competed for customers. They defended their secret recipes. And they were often caught between physicians, who accused them of overstepping, and patients who begged them for cures the doctors couldn't offer. To become an apothecary, you needed a nose for herbs, a talent for mixing, and sometimes a knack for alchemy. You also needed a good memory, because dosages were rarely written down and often lethal if mismeasured. But apothecaries were also businessmen. They competed for customers. They defended their secret recipes. And they were often caught between physicians who accused them of overstepping and patients who begged them for cures the doctors couldn't offer. And finally, there were the folk healers. These were the wise women, midwives, herbalists, and hedge doctors who lived outside the professional system. They didn't wear robes or carry scrolls, but they knew plants. They knew symptoms, and they had the trust of the community. Folk healers were often the first and last resort for the poor. They delivered babies, treated fevers, soothed burns, and cared for the dying, but they lived under constant suspicion. Their knowledge passed down orally was seen as mysterious and dangerous. Many were accused of witchcraft. Some were executed. So, what did it really take to become a medieval doctor? For physicians, it took education, but mostly the ability to sound authoritative while quoting long dead Greeks. For surgeons, it took nerve the guts to cut open a body and stitch it shut. For apothecaries, it took cunning, the ability to mix, sell, and survive. For folk healers, it took instinct, and the ability to avoid being burned as a witch. There was no licensing board, no standardized training, no malpractice insurance. Anyone could claim to be a healer if they were persuasive enough. And if your patients died, well, maybe their humors were just too far gone. The result was a chaotic patchwork of care. Some towns had a handful of doctors. Others had none. A patient's outcome depended less on medical science and more on geography, wealth, and luck, and yet people kept becoming doctors. Not because the job was easy, but because even in a world without germ theory, anesthesia, or understanding, people got sick, people got hurt, and someone had to try so they studied what they could, learned what was available, and practiced often with tragic results until they got better, or until they ran out of patience in the end. Being a medieval doctor wasn't about competence. It was about conviction. Speak with confidence, wear a long robe, and you were halfway there. The rest, trial and error. Mostly error. There's panic, and then there is plague panic, a fear so profound it erodes the rules of society. For medieval doctors, the arrival of a plague was not just a professional crisis. It was an event that stripped away even the pretense of control. Because in the face of mass death, all the urine charts, bloodletting knives, and herbal poultices meant nothing. Medicine, in the time of pandemics, was a theater of failure. Let us begin with the most infamous example, the Black Death, when the plague arrived in Europe in the 14th century. It didn't creep. It exploded. Entire towns were infected within days. Corpses piled up in the streets. And doctors, those who didn't flee, could only stand by and watch. Or guess. Or pray. Medieval medicine had no concept of bacteria or viruses. Disease was explained through imbalanced humors, bad air, miasma, divine punishment, or astrological misalignment. The Black Death didn't fit neatly into any of these categories. It spread too quickly. It killed too efficiently. It resisted every known treatment. The symptoms were grotesque. Fever, vomiting, buboes large, black swellings in the armpits or groin, death within days, sometimes within hours. No two patients were exactly the same, and nothing made sense. Physicians argued about causes, remedies, and contagion, but none of it worked. Some advised fleeing the cities. Others said to stay indoors and light incense. Some prescribed crushed emeralds, rosewater baths, or a strict diet of vinegar. Lettuce. More extreme cures involved bleeding patients nearly to death, or applying live plucked chickens to their sores, as if the chicken might somehow absorb the illness. But most medieval doctors were left doing what they did best, guessing. The plague was immune to theory. It didn't care about robes, degrees, or Galen. For many physicians, the only option left was to walk away, abandon their patients, abandon their towns, and in many cases, abandon their faith, because this was not just a public health crisis, it was a spiritual one. How could such suffering exist unless it was willed by God? Some believed it was punishment for sin. Others saw it as a sign of the apocalypse. Flagellant cults roamed the countryside, beating themselves in the streets to atone for humanity's guilt. Doctors, caught between science and religion, could offer no reassurance. Only silence. Then came the masks. The now iconic plague doctor. Outfit: a long cloak, leather gloves, and the beaked mask filled with herbs and spices. It was not just for protection. It was a performance, a uniform to make doctors feel less powerless. The herbs were meant to purify the air. The beak kept the stink of death at bay. But the mask didn't protect against the real danger. Nothing did, and still, the sick kept coming. The infected crawled into churches, into clinics, into alleyways. Some cried for help. Others wept in silence. And doctors, those who remained, kept trying. They lanced buboes, they bled patients, they prayed, and they died in large numbers. Because the plague didn't care if you wore a robe or a beak or had read every book in the monastery library. The mortality rate among doctors was as high as anyone else's. Knowledge was not immunity. After the wave passed, and it always passed, eventually medicine had to rebuild itself. But not always wisely. New theories emerged. Many of them were just as wrong. But what the plague did more than anything was expose the limits of medical power. Doctors were not saviors. They were human, and the Black Death showed just how small and fragile that humanity really was. But plagues didn't end with the Black Death. There were other waves. Other illnesses, smallpox, sweating sickness, influenza, leprosy, and in each case, medieval medicine responded the same way, with fear, ritual, and the eternal hope that maybe, this time, the treatments might work. They rarely did, because they were built on a foundation of misunderstandings. The human body was not what they believed it to be. Disease did not obey their rules. And so the physician's world was built on sand, impressive, elaborate, but dangerously unstable. Still, there is something noble in the medieval doctor's helplessness. Because even when the plague was roaring through the streets, even when the corpses filled carts and the bells tolled day and night, some doctors stayed. They didn't run. They stood in the filth and horror and tried desperately to help. Even when help meant nothing more than closing a dying patient's eyes. In the end, perhaps that was all they could do. Not cure, not save, but witness and be there at the end. When no one else would come close, medieval doctors were surrounded by death. It clung to them like the scent of herbs and blood that never quite washed off. They saw it daily in the open wounds of soldiers, in the hollow stares of fevered children, in the bloated bodies dragged from plague-ridden homes. And yet no amount of experience truly prepared them for the final moments when a patient, after all the prayers, potions, poultices, and pain, simply ... stop today. We talk about death as something clinical. A moment marked on a chart, in a hospital room with machines and monitors. But in the Middle Ages, death was a ritual, a spectacle, and above all, a mystery. To a medieval doctor, death was not just the failure of the body, it was the departure of the soul. And the doctor's role in that process was both practical and spiritual. Most medieval patients died at home or in monastic infirmaries. If they were lucky, the wealthy might have a physician attend their final days, carefully noting symptoms, administering calming draughts, and whispering hopeful nonsense about recovery. But deep down, everyone, doctor included, knew when the end was coming. God, it began with the last rites. If time allowed, a priest would be called to deliver the sacrament, confession, and the Eucharist. The room would quiet. Candles lit, family gathered. The doctor might step aside or stay and watch, hands folded behind his back. The heavy scent of medicinal wine still clinging to his robe. In these moments, the physician became a witness. Not just to the failure of flesh, but to the transition of the human being from this world to the next. He might offer a sip of warm broth, place a cloth on a sweating brow, or recite a few lines from scripture if he knew them. Some doctors carried small relics, holy charms or bones of saints, to place near the dying, in a final attempt to tip the balance. But more often than not, the doctor had already exhausted his tools. The bleeding bowl had been emptied. The leeches returned to their jars. The herbal infusion had been swallowed or spilled. And now there was only the silence between breaths, the long pause before the end. Some deaths were quiet, peaceful, a closing of the eyes, a last exhale. Others were violent, convulsions, screams, blood. The doctor had to watch it all, endure it, and then, when it was done, pronounce the death not with instruments, but by instinct. Cold skin, no breath, eyes that no longer moved. Some doctors believed they could see death before it arrived. A shadow on the face, a change in the voice, a sudden peace after hours of suffering. They called it the art of dying ars moriendi and considered it something to be mastered, not just by the dying, but by those who stood beside them. When a patient passed, the doctor's work wasn't always done. He might be asked to confirm the death for legal or religious purposes, to offer words of comfort to the family, or in some cases, to dissect the body in secret hoping to learn. What went wrong? Though true anatomical study was rare and discouraged, death also had economic consequences. Did the family still owe the physician a fee? Had they paid in advance? Was there a promise of a reward if the patient survived? These awkward questions lingered in the air, even as the candles burned down. In towns where death was frequent during plagues, sieges, famines, doctors often went unpaid. Or worse, blame. Because make no mistake, in many cases, the death of a patient ruined a doctor's reputation, especially if the death was sudden or unexpected. The family might accuse him of incompetence. The church might suggest impiety. Neighbors whispered. The wrong death at the wrong time could destroy a career. Some doctors responded by becoming cold, emotionally distant. They stopped caring or pretended not to. Others fell into despair, haunted by the faces of the dying, the treatments that failed, the things they could not explain. There were no therapists, no grief counselors, only more patients, more death. A few retreated into alchemy or mysticism, convinced that the secrets of life and death could be discovered if they just studied harder, mixed the right metals, or found the philosopher's stone. They spent their nights in flickering, candlelight, stirring bubbling pots, chasing shadows. Anything to make sense of the senseless. And still, death came. Medieval doctors weren't blind to their limits. They knew deep down that their treatments were more hope than science. That the body often ignored their efforts. That their role, more often than not, was simply to be present. To try to bear witness. So when the time came, they stood at the bedside, held the hand, whispered a final word, and watched once more as life slipped quietly away, not with dignity, not with answers, but with the dull resignation of those who have seen it all before, yet still don't understand. Medieval medicine may seem laughable, now leech therapy, bad air and bile balancing, but its legacy still lingers. Not just in dusty museum texts, or bizarre historical trivia, but in the very roots of how we practice medicine today. Because what medieval doctors left behind wasn't just a record of failure. It was the blueprint for something better. And yet, as strange as it sounds, of what we kept, we probably shouldn't have. Let's begin with the structures. Many of today's medical systems, academic hierarchies, specialist roles, hospital wards can trace their earliest versions to the Middle Ages. Medieval universities, despite their obsession with astrology and ancient Greek texts, were among the first places to formalize the study of medicine. They offered degrees. They insisted on Latin, and they established that to be a physician meant belonging to an elite intellectual class. That division stuck. Even now, the medical world often draws sharp lines between the academic and the practical, between the physician in the lecture hall and the nurse or technician at the bedside. In the middle ages, a physician didn't get his hands dirty. The barber surgeon did that. And although today's surgeons are among the most prestigious in the field, the shadow of that old divide lingers in the way. Some professions are valued more than others. We also inherited a deep and sometimes dangerous reverence for authority. In medieval times, questioning Galen or Hippocrates was unthinkable. Their writings were considered gospel. This mindset made progress slow, because if the ancients were always right, then innovation was heresy. And yet, even in modern medicine, we often see similar patterns. A resistance to new ideas, a preference for tradition, a fear of going against the consensus. The tools of diagnosis also owe something to medieval habits. Physicians in the middle. Ages made their judgments by looking, listening, and yes, smelling and tasting. They examined urine closely, noting color, smell, and texture. They took detailed patient histories, not out of scientific necessity, but because they had little else to rely on. Today's medical interviews, physical exams, and even the art of bedside manner are descendants of those early diagnostic rituals. But not all legacies were good. One of the most toxic remnants of medieval medicine was the idea that some people deserved care more than others. In many towns, the poor were simply left to die. Lepers were banished to colonies. The mentally ill were chained or hidden. And women, especially healers, were treated with deep suspicion, often branded witches, silenced, or even executed. These biases didn't vanish with the Renaissance. They endured, and in some cases evolved into the systemic inequalities we still see today, where race, gender, class, and location still shape the quality of care people receive. Even the language we use in medicine has roots in medieval thought. We still talk about venting one's spleen, a phrase based on the belief that the spleen controlled anger. We say someone is phlegmatic or choleric, not realizing those words describe the balance of humors. The ghost of medieval theory still flickers in our metaphors, our habits, and our assumptions. There's also the question of trust. In the medieval world, a doctor was someone who looked the part. A long robe, a beard, a book. That was often enough to gain respect, whether or not they knew what they were doing. And while we like to think modern medicine is based on science alone, appearance and confidence still matter. Patients still often judge their doctors by tone, posture, and attire, not just by competence. And perhaps the most haunting legacy is the desire to appear in control, even when there is none. Medieval doctors often prescribed treatments they knew wouldn't help, not because they were malicious, but because they couldn't bear to do nothing. They needed to offer something, anything. And in many ways, we still do this today. Prescriptions, just in case. Tests for peace of mind. Rituals of reassurance. But amidst all this inherited confusion, there were seeds of something better. The medieval period gave us hospitals, crude though they were. It gave us record keeping, however inconsistent. It gave us the idea that studying illness might help future patients, not just the current ones. And it gave us, above all, the notion that trying to heal, even in ignorance, is better than giving up. It's easy to mock medieval doctors. They prescribed crushed beetles and pig urine. They drilled holes in skulls to let out spirits. They feared comets and blamed astrology, but they also cared. They sat by the sick. They listened. They experimented. And from their countless mistakes, we eventually learned. Today, we stand on the shoulders of these confused, robe-wearing, plague-fleeing men. And we owe them a strange kind of gratitude, not because they were right, but because they tried. In the darkness of medieval ignorance, they reached for the light, and sometimes they found it. The legacy they left is flawed, bloody, and often absurd. But it is also human, and maybe that's what medicine has always been. Not a perfect science, but a messy, desperate, hopeful act of being human together. So, after all, we've been through leeches, urine charts, beaked masks, open sores, and crushed emeralds. You still want to be a medieval doctor? Let's take a moment to lie down, slow everything down, and drift back over this very sticky and confusing career path. Consider this your sleepy, boring recap. No exams. No lectures, just a soft trail of strange images and unsettling facts. To lull you into medieval dreams. First, remember the education, or rather the illusion of it. You've studied for years, in Latin, not anatomy, but Aristotle. You debated how bile affects personality. You flipped through books bound in leather, quoting Galen to anyone who would listen. You became a doctor not by touching patients, but by learning to explain why they were sick using words like melancholia and superfluity. If you were a barber surgeon, your journey was Messier. You apprenticed in blood. You set bones with your bare hands. You pulled teeth, cut flesh, and boiled your tools if you remembered. You didn't quote Latin, you carried knives. People trusted you because you were nearby, not because you were trained. You might have mixed herbs in an apothecary shop, where the air smelled like vinegar, rosemary, and whatever rotting root had been delivered that morning. You counted dried beetles as ingredients. You sold cures with names like dragon's breath powder and poppy elixir. Sometimes it helped. Often it didn't. And then the plague came. You wore your long coat and your gloves. Your bird mask with cloves and lavender stuffed inside. You walked through the streets past carts of bodies. You bled people and burned herbs. Nothing worked. You watched, helpless. You prayed quietly. You ran out of words. Every day someone died. A fever that wouldn't break. A wound that wouldn't heal. A disease that spread too fast. And you, medieval doctor, were expected to stop it all with nothing but a book, a jar of worms, and your reputation. Sometimes you pretended to know. Sometimes you just hoped no one noticed how scared you were at the bedside. You whispered, comfort. Sometimes from scripture, sometimes from memory. You closed eyes. You crossed hands. You told the family it was peaceful, even if it wasn't. You left quietly. You moved on to the next house. You were blamed, sometimes. Thanked, sometimes. Forgotten, mostly. And yet you kept going. Because that's what a doctor did. And what did we inherit from you? Well, your robes became lab coats. Your bleeding knives became scalpels. Your herbal poultices evolved into pills with names we can't pronounce. But your hesitation, your humanity, we kept that. We still fear death. We still pretend to know more than we do. We still divide medicine into neat. Rolls, healer, cutter, mixer, guesser. We still want doctors who sound wise, even when answers are scarce. But maybe that's all right. Maybe in some quiet corner of time, the medieval doctor isn't so far from us after all. Still trying. Still failing. Still hoping to help Dot, so if you still want to be a medieval doctor, go ahead. Put on your robe. Grab your smelling herbs. Quote, a line from Galen, then walk into the next room where a patient waits. And try to ease their pain. Even if it doesn't work. Even if it never did. Dot now. Close your eyes. The candles are out. The herbs are spent. And outside the plague. Bells have stopped. You've done what you could. Dot sleep well, doctor. You've earned it.